The morning sun cast long shadows across the elementary school parking lot as Frank Martinez adjusted his worn baseball cap and checked his watch. At 68 years old, the Vietnam veteran had developed a routine that rarely varied. Every Tuesday and Thursday, he picked up his granddaughter Emma from Jefferson Elementary at exactly 3:15. His old Ford pickup truck, faded blue with rust spots that told stories of decades of faithful service, sat in the designated pickup zone among the other vehicles. Frank had served 2 tours in Vietnam as a combat medic before returning home to build a quiet life. He married his high school sweetheart, raised 3 children, and worked 30 years at the local manufacturing plant. Retirement had been good to him, especially the time spent with Emma, his youngest son's 8-year-old daughter. She was the light of his life, always running to his truck with stories about her day and a backpack full of artwork she had created just for him. Today felt different, though. Frank noticed the police cruiser parked across the street from the school earlier that morning when he had driven by on his way to the grocery store. It was still there now, and he could see 2 officers inside watching the school grounds. He assumed they were providing extra security, something that had become more common in recent years. As a veteran who understood the importance of vigilance, Frank appreciated their presence even if it made him slightly uneasy. The school bell rang at 3 o'clock, and within minutes, children began streaming out of the building. Frank climbed out of his truck and walked toward the designated pickup area, his military-issued dog tags jingling softly beneath his flannel shirt. His gait was steady but showed the subtle signs of age and old injuries from his service. The metal plate in his left leg, a souvenir from a mortar attack near Da Nang, made him move with deliberate care on cold days like this one. Emma emerged from the crowd of children, her blonde pigtails bouncing as she ran toward him. Her face lit up with the pure joy that only a child could express, and Frank felt his heart warm despite the chill in the air. She clutched a drawing in her small hands, probably another picture of their family, or maybe the horses she loved to draw. "Grandpa Frank," she called out, her voice carrying over the chatter of other children and parents. "Look what I made for you." Frank smiled and opened his arms to receive her customary hug. This was the best part of his week, these moments when the world seemed simple and good. Emma crashed into him with the enthusiasm only grandchildren possessed, and he lifted her up despite his protesting back. She was getting bigger every month, but he would never tell her she was too heavy for their ritual greeting. "What did you learn today, little scholar?" Frank asked, setting her down gently and taking her backpack from her shoulders. The bag was decorated with unicorns and rainbows, a stark contrast to his own utilitarian preferences, but he loved everything about it because it was hers. Emma began chattering about her math test and how her friend Sarah had lost a tooth at lunch. Frank listened attentively, asking questions and making appropriate sounds of amazement at her stories. They walked slowly toward his truck, Emma's small hand tucked securely in his larger, weathered one. Other parents and grandparents moved around them in the familiar dance of school pickup time, everyone focused on collecting their precious cargo and heading home. As they reached his truck, Frank noticed the police cruiser had moved. It was now parked directly behind his vehicle, and both officers were standing beside their car. The younger officer, who looked to be in his 20s with the eager demeanor of someone new to the job, had his hand resting on his radio. The older officer appeared more seasoned, with gray temples and the measured stance of experience. Frank felt a familiar tension creep up his spine, the same alertness that had kept him alive in the jungle decades ago. He had always maintained a respectful relationship with law enforcement, understanding that they had difficult jobs and deserved the benefit of the doubt. But something about their positioning and body language triggered his old instincts. "Grandpa, why are those policemen looking at us?" Emma asked, her voice smaller now, the excitement of sharing her day temporarily forgotten. Frank squeezed her hand gently. "Probably just doing their job, sweetheart. Nothing to worry about." He kept his voice calm and reassuring, though internally he was running through possibilities. Had he parked incorrectly? Was there some school policy he was unaware of? He made a mental note to check with the school office about any new procedures. The younger officer began walking toward them, his partner following a few steps behind. Frank noticed that the officer's right hand hovered near his duty belt, a gesture that seemed unnecessary for whatever routine interaction this might be. Frank had spent enough time around military and law enforcement to recognize defensive positioning when he saw it. "Excuse me, sir," the young officer called out when he was about 20 feet away. "Can I speak with you for a moment?" Frank nodded and turned toward the officers, instinctively positioning himself between them and Emma. "Of course, officer. How can I help you?" The older officer spoke up, his voice professional, but carrying an edge that Frank couldn't quite identify. "We've received reports about suspicious activity in this area. Someone matching your description has been seen loitering around the school grounds." Frank felt his eyebrows rise in confusion. "I pick up my granddaughter here twice a week, officers. I've been doing so for the past 2 years. Emma Martinez, 3rd grade, Mrs. Patterson's class." He gestured toward Emma, who had moved slightly behind his leg but was still holding his hand. The younger officer consulted a small notebook. "What's your relationship to the child, sir?" "I'm her grandfather," Frank replied, his confusion growing. "Frank Martinez. I have permission from her father to pick her up on Tuesdays and Thursdays." He reached slowly toward his back pocket where he kept his wallet, intending to show his identification. "Keep your hands visible, sir," the younger officer said sharply, his voice suddenly much more tense. His hand moved closer to his weapon, and Frank felt the situation shifting into dangerous territory. Frank immediately raised both hands, palms outward. His military training kicked in automatically. De-escalate, comply with lawful orders, protect the innocent. Emma was the innocent here, and her safety was his primary concern. "I was just reaching for my ID, officers," Frank said calmly. "I want to cooperate fully with whatever you need." The older officer stepped forward. "We're going to need you to step away from the child, sir." Frank's heart began to pound, not from fear for himself, but from the growing realization that this situation was spiraling beyond logic. "Officer, this is my granddaughter. I can show you my identification, call her father, contact the school office. There are teachers here who know me." Around them, other parents and children were beginning to notice the confrontation. Frank could see people stopping their conversations and turning to watch. Some were pulling out cell phones, whether to call for help or to record what was happening, he couldn't tell. The attention made everything feel more urgent and potentially explosive. Emma tugged on his shirt. "Grandpa, I am scared." Frank looked down at her frightened face and felt anger beginning to mix with his confusion. This was supposed to be a simple school pickup, a routine part of their week together. Now his granddaughter was being exposed to something that could traumatize her. And for what? A case of mistaken identity? A miscommunication? "It's okay, Emma," he said softly. "Everything's going to be fine." But as he looked back at the officers, Frank wasn't entirely sure that was true. The tension in the air was palpable, and he recognized the signs of a situation that could escalate quickly despite everyone's best intentions. His mind raced through his options, all of them focused on keeping Emma safe while trying to resolve what had to be a misunderstanding. The afternoon sun continued to shine down on the elementary school parking lot, but for Frank Martinez, Vietnam veteran and devoted grandfather, the shadows were growing longer and darker by the minute. What had started as an ordinary Tuesday was about to become something none of them would ever forget. The standoff in the school parking lot stretched into its 3rd minute, though to Frank it felt like hours. More parents had gathered at a distance, some shepherding their own children away from the scene, while others remained to watch. Frank could hear hushed conversations and the occasional click of a smartphone camera. The attention made his skin crawl, not because he was ashamed of anything, but because Emma was being exposed to this spectacle. "Sir, I need you to step away from the child," the older officer repeated, his voice carrying more authority now. "This is for everyone's safety while we sort this out." Frank's jaw tightened. Every fiber of his being rebelled against the idea of leaving Emma alone, even for a moment. In Vietnam, you never abandoned your wounded, never left anyone behind. That principle had guided him through 2 tours of duty and 40 years of civilian life afterward. He wasn't about to start now, especially not with his own granddaughter. Officer, with all due respect, I'm not leaving my granddaughter. She's 8 years old, and she's scared. If you need to verify my identity, I'm happy to cooperate, but I'm staying right here with her. The younger officer's hand dropped to his taser. Sir, you're not complying with a lawful order. I need you to step back now. Frank noticed the movement toward the taser and felt his old combat instincts surge. Not aggression. He had learned long ago to control that, but awareness. The kind of heightened alertness that had kept him alive when every shadow could hide an enemy. He recognized the signs of an officer who was nervous, possibly inexperienced, and definitely escalating a situation that didn't need to escalate. Emma, sweetheart, Frank said quietly, not taking his eyes off the officers, I want you to walk over to Mrs. Patterson. Can you see her by the school door? Emma nodded, tears starting to form in her eyes. She had never seen her grandfather in any kind of confrontation, and the sight of police officers treating him like a criminal was beyond her understanding. It's okay, baby girl. Just go stand with Mrs. Patterson and wait for Grandpa. All right. Mrs. Patterson, a veteran teacher in her 50s who had indeed known Frank for 2 years, had emerged from the school building when she noticed the commotion. She immediately understood what Frank was trying to do and walked forward with her arms open. Come here, Emma, she called gently. Let's let the grown-ups talk. Emma looked up at Frank one more time, seeking reassurance. He managed a smile for her, the kind of smile he had perfected over years of being a grandfather, warm, confident, and completely at odds with how he actually felt in that moment. Go ahead, sweetheart. I'll be right over in just a minute. Emma reluctantly let go of his hand and walked slowly toward her teacher. Frank watched until she was safely in Mrs. Patterson's care before turning his full attention back to the officers. With Emma out of immediate harm's way, he could focus on de-escalating whatever this was. Now, officers, how can we resolve this? Frank asked, keeping his voice level and respectful. I'm willing to show you identification, contact my son who is Emma's father, or call the school administration. What would help? The older officer pulled out his own notebook. We received a call about a suspicious older man hanging around the school. Someone who seemed to be watching children inappropriately. Frank felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October weather. The implication hit him like a physical blow, and for a moment he was speechless. After a lifetime of service to his country and community, after raising 3 children and being a devoted grandfather, someone had essentially accused him of being a predator. Officer, Frank said carefully, his voice tight with controlled emotion, I've been picking up my granddaughter from this school for 2 years. I park in the designated pickup area. I wait in my truck until school is dismissed, and then I collect Emma and take her home. I've never behaved inappropriately toward any child, and I never would. The younger officer seemed unmoved. The caller was very specific about the description and the vehicle. Frank glanced back at his truck, a 15-year-old Ford pickup that was common enough in this part of town. Half the construction workers and retirees in the area drove similar vehicles. The description could have fit any number of people. What exactly did the caller say I was doing? Frank asked. Sitting in a vehicle, watching children for extended periods, taking photographs, exhibiting behavior consistent with. The officer consulted his notes, potential predatory surveillance. Frank's hands clenched involuntarily. The accusation was so far from reality that it felt surreal. He had never taken photographs at the school, except for the occasional picture of Emma with her friends when she specifically asked him to. He certainly had never engaged in any kind of surveillance of children. Officers, I think there's been a serious mistake here. I'm a Vietnam veteran, a retired factory worker, and a grandfather. I have no criminal history, no history of inappropriate behavior, and multiple character witnesses right here at this school. Mrs. Patterson, who had been listening from where she stood with Emma, decided to intervene. Officers, Mr. Martinez is well known to our staff. He's been picking up his granddaughter regularly for 2 years. He's always been polite, appropriate, and punctual. I think there may be some confusion here." The older officer looked toward Mrs. Patterson, then back at Frank. For a moment, Frank thought he saw a flicker of uncertainty in a man's eyes, as if he was beginning to realize that they might have made an error. But the younger officer was not ready to back down. "Sir, we still need to verify your identity and your right to be here with this child. I'm going to need you to place your hands behind your back while we sort this out." Frank felt the blood drain from his face. "You're arresting me? For what?" "Not arresting, sir. Detaining for investigation." "On what grounds?" "Suspicious activity, failure to comply with lawful orders, and potential child endangerment." The words hit Frank like artillery shells. Child endangerment. After everything he had done to protect children, his own, his grandchildren, the young soldiers under his care in Vietnam, he was being accused of endangering a child. "Officer, I respectfully decline to be handcuffed in front of my granddaughter without being formally arrested and charged with a specific crime. I've answered your questions, provided information about who I am, and offered to provide identification. If you believe I've committed a crime, then arrest me and read me my rights. Otherwise, I'd like to collect my granddaughter and go home." The standoff had reached a critical point. Frank could see that several parents had pulled out their phones and were actively recording. Mrs. Patterson was trying to distract Emma, but the 8-year-old was clearly terrified and confused by what she was seeing. The younger officer's face reddened with frustration. "Sir, you're being argumentative and non-compliant. Turn around and put your hands behind your back now." Frank's military bearing straightened. 45 years after leaving the service, he still carried himself like the soldier he had once been. "I'm being respectful and cooperative, officer. I'm not being argumentative. I'm standing here calmly, with my hands visible, answering your questions. But I will not be handcuffed without cause in front of my granddaughter." The tension in the parking lot was becoming unbearable. Other parents were moving their children further away, sensing that the situation was about to explode into something much worse. Mrs. Patterson was speaking softly to Emma, but Frank could see his granddaughter straining to watch what was happening to him. The younger officer's hand moved to his taser again, and Frank saw the exact moment when the situation crossed from tense to dangerous. There was a look in the young man's eyes that Frank had seen before, in young soldiers who were scared, overwhelmed, and about to make a decision they would regret forever. "Officer," Frank said quietly, "please think about what you're about to do. I'm a 68-year-old grandfather standing in a school parking lot with witnesses and cameras everywhere. I haven't threatened anyone, I haven't been violent, and I haven't broken any laws. My granddaughter is watching this happen. Please don't do something we'll all regret." But Frank could see in the officer's stance that his words weren't getting through. The young man was committed to a course of action now, driven by pride, training, or fear. Frank couldn't tell which. All he knew was that in the next few seconds, everything was going to change, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The October afternoon sun continued to shine down on Jefferson Elementary School, but storm clouds were gathering in the form of flashing lights, raised voices, and the growing certainty that this situation was about to spiral completely out of control. Frank Martinez, who had survived combat in Vietnam and 40 years of civilian life without serious incident, was about to face the fight of his life in the most unlikely of places, a school parking lot, in front of his terrified granddaughter. The moment seemed to freeze in time before everything exploded into chaos. The younger officer, his face flushed with frustration and adrenaline, made his decision. Without further warning, he drew his taser and pointed it at Frank's chest. "Last chance, sir. Hands behind your back now." Frank saw the weapon come up and felt his world narrow to a pinpoint of focused awareness. Time slowed the way it had during mortar attacks in Vietnam, every detail becoming crystal clear. The yellow plastic of the taser, the officer's white knuckles on the grip, the sound of Emma crying behind him, the gasps from the gathering crowd of parents. "Officer, please don't," Frank began, but he never finished the sentence. The taser fired with a sharp crackling sound that cut through the afternoon air like a knife. 2 barbs struck Frank in the center of his chest, and 50,000 volts of electricity coursed through his body. His muscles seized instantly, his nervous system overwhelmed by the artificial lightning running through his veins. He collapsed to the asphalt like a marionette with its strings cut, his body convulsing uncontrollably as the current continued to flow. The screaming started immediately. Emma's voice rose above all the others, a child's pure terror and confusion piercing the air. "Grandpa! Grandpa!" She tried to run toward him, but Mrs. Patterson held her back, both of them crying now. Frank's world became a kaleidoscope of pain and disorientation. The electricity felt like every nerve in his body was being set on fire simultaneously. His military training had prepared him for many things, but this was unlike any pain he had ever experienced. It wasn't just the physical agony, it was the complete loss of control, the helplessness of his body betraying him in front of his granddaughter. The 5-second cycle felt like an eternity. When it finally ended, Frank lay gasping on the cold asphalt, his body twitching with residual muscle contractions. He could taste blood where he had bitten his tongue, and his heart was hammering against his ribs like it might explode. At 68, with a pacemaker installed 3 years earlier after a mild heart attack, Frank wasn't sure his cardiovascular system could handle the shock. The parking lot erupted in shouting. Multiple parents were now recording the incident, their phones held high as they documented what they had just witnessed. Someone was calling for an ambulance. Others were demanding to know why the officers had used such force on an elderly man who hadn't posed any physical threat. "Jesus Christ," one father yelled. "What the hell is wrong with you? He's a grandfather." The older officer, who had seemed uncomfortable with his partner's escalation from the beginning, now looked horrified by what had just happened. He knelt down beside Frank, checking for a pulse and responsiveness while keeping his eye on the increasingly angry crowd. "Frank, can you hear me?" the older officer asked, using Frank's first name for the first time. "Stay with me, sir." Frank tried to speak, but could only manage a hoarse whisper. "Emma, is Emma okay?" The question broke something in the older officer's expression. Here was a man who had just been tossed, was possibly having a cardiac event, and his first concern was for his granddaughter's well-being. It was not the reaction of a criminal or a predator. "She's fine, sir. She's with her teacher. Just try to breathe slowly." The younger officer was now facing a semicircle of furious parents, all of them demanding explanations. Several were already on their phones with what Frank assumed were 911 calls and probably lawyers. The officer looked like he was beginning to realize the magnitude of what he had just done. Mrs. Patterson, still holding Emma, walked as close as the older officer would allow. "Mr. Martinez, I've called your son. He's on his way. Emma's okay. She's right here with me." Frank managed to turn his head enough to see his granddaughter. Emma's face was streaked with tears, her small body shaking with sobs. The sight of her distress hurt worse than the electricity had. He tried to give her a reassuring smile, but wasn't sure if his facial muscles were cooperating yet. I'm okay, sweetheart," he managed to say, though his voice was barely audible. "Grandpa's okay." The wail of sirens began to grow in the distance, getting louder by the second. Frank wasn't sure if it was an ambulance or more police units, but he hoped it was medical help. His chest felt tight, and there was a burning sensation that had nothing to do with the taser barbs still embedded in his shirt. As he lay there on the asphalt, struggling to regain his breath and his bearings, Frank found himself thinking about Vietnam. He had been wounded twice during his tours, once by shrapnel from a mortar round, and once by small arms fire during an ambush. Both times, he had been surrounded by enemies trying to kill him. Both times, he had understood why he was being hurt, even if he disagreed with the politics of the war. This was different. This was incomprehensible. He was lying on the ground in front of his granddaughter's school, having been electrocuted by police officers who were supposed to protect and serve. The cognitive dissonance was almost as painful as the physical trauma. The ambulance arrived first, followed closely by 2 more police cruisers. Frank watched through blurred vision as paramedics rushed toward him with their equipment bags and stretcher. The lead paramedic, a woman in her 30s with kind eyes and competent hands, immediately began checking his vital signs. "Sir, I'm Linda. I'm a paramedic. Can you tell me your name?" "Frank Martinez," he replied, his voice growing stronger. "Vietnam veteran, age 68, pacemaker installed in 2021. Linda's eyebrows rose slightly at the mention of the pacemaker. Tasers and cardiac devices didn't always play well together. She immediately began setting up an EKG machine to check his heart rhythm. "Any chest pain, sir? Difficulty breathing? Dizziness? Some chest tightness? Breathing's getting better. Feel like I went 10 rounds with Muhammad Ali." Linda smiled despite the circumstances. "Well, your sense of humor seems intact. That's a good sign." As the paramedics worked on Frank, the situation around them continued to evolve rapidly. The 2 additional police units that had arrived included a supervisor, a sergeant with 20 years of experience who took one look at the scene and immediately began damage control. Frank could hear him talking urgently with the 2 original officers, his voice carrying the tone of someone who was very unhappy with what he was seeing. More parents had arrived as word spread about what had happened. Some were picking up their children early, not wanting them to witness any more of the incident. Others were staying to offer support to Frank and to serve as witnesses to what they had seen. The general mood was one of outrage and disbelief. Emma had calmed down somewhat, but she kept asking Mrs. Patterson when she could see her grandfather. Frank could hear her small voice asking if Grandpa was going to die and whether the police were going to hurt him again. Each question felt like another knife in his heart. "Linda," Frank said to the paramedic as she monitored his heart rhythm, "my granddaughter is over there. She saw the whole thing. Can you let her know I'm going to be okay?" Linda glanced toward where Emma stood with Mrs. Patterson. Her expression softened as she saw the frightened 8-year-old girl clutching her teacher's hand. "Your heart rhythm looks stable, Mr. Martinez. The pacemaker seems to have protected you from the worst of it. I think you're going to be just fine." She raised her voice slightly. "Emma, your grandpa is doing much better now. His heart is nice and strong." Emma's face brightened slightly, though she was still crying. Frank managed to raise his hand and wave at her, which brought the first small smile he had seen from her since this nightmare began. As Linda and her partner prepared to transport Frank to the hospital for additional monitoring, a new vehicle pulled into the parking lot. It was a black sedan with government plates, followed by another identical vehicle. Frank couldn't see who was getting out, but he noticed that the police sergeant's demeanor changed immediately when he saw the new arrivals. "Linda," Frank said quietly, "what's that about?" The paramedic followed his gaze and shrugged. "Above my pay grade, sir. Let's focus on getting you checked out at the hospital." But Frank's military-trained eyes had caught something that made his blood run cold. The men getting out of the black sedans were wearing tactical gear under their civilian clothes. He could see the telltale bulges of body armor and concealed weapons. These weren't local investigators or social workers. As the stretcher lifted him toward the ambulance, Frank caught a glimpse of one of the newcomers talking intensely with the police sergeant. The man was showing some kind of identification, and the sergeant's face was growing progressively paler as he read whatever was being shown to him. Frank had a sinking feeling that being tossed by local police was about to become the least of his problems. Something much bigger than a case of mistaken identity was unfolding around him, and he had no idea what it was or why his simple school pickup routine had triggered such an extreme response. The ambulance doors closed, cutting off his view of the parking lot and the mysterious arrivals. As the vehicle pulled away with sirens wailing, Frank could only hope that Emma would be safe and that whatever was happening would be resolved quickly. But deep in his gut, the instincts that had kept him alive in Vietnam were telling him that this was just the beginning of something much more serious than anyone had realized. The emergency room at Memorial Hospital was buzzing with controlled chaos when Frank arrived. Word had apparently traveled fast about the incident at the school because he was immediately whisked into a private room instead of waiting in the general area. As the paramedics transferred him to the hospital bed, Frank noticed two men in dark suits standing near the nurse's station, their eyes following his movements with professional intensity. Dr. Sarah Chun, the attending physician, was a no-nonsense woman in her 40s who had seen everything during her 15 years in emergency medicine. But as she reviewed Frank's chart and the paramedic's report, her expression showed genuine concern that went beyond his medical condition. "Mr. Martinez, I'm Dr. Chun. How are you feeling right now?" "Like I stuck my finger in a light socket," document. "But I've been worse." Dr. Chun smiled briefly at his attempt at humor, then grew serious. "Your EKG looks stable, which is good news given your pacemaker. But I want to keep you for observation for a few hours. Taser injuries in patients with cardiac devices can sometimes have delayed effects." As she spoke, Frank noticed one of the suited men approach the doorway. The doctor saw him too and immediately moved to block his access to the room. "I'm sorry, but this patient needs medical attention right now. You'll have to wait." The man showed her a badge or identification that Frank couldn't see clearly, but Dr. Chin's expression hardened rather than softened. "I don't care who you are. He's my patient, and he's not going anywhere until I'm satisfied with his medical condition." Frank felt a surge of gratitude for the doctor's protective stance, but also a growing sense of unease about who these people were and what they wanted with him. Through the small window in his room's door, he could see more suits arriving in the emergency department. Whatever this was, it was bigger than a local police matter. A nurse came in to draw blood and check his vital signs again. As she worked, she spoke quietly to Frank. "Your son is here, Mr. Martinez. He's in the waiting room with your granddaughter. She's been asking for you." Frank's heart clenched at the thought of Emma, still being frightened and confused. "Is she okay? Physically, I mean." "She's fine physically. Just scared. Your son seems pretty upset about what happened." That was an understatement, Frank was sure. David Martinez was a county prosecutor with a strong sense of justice and an even stronger protective instinct when it came to his family. Frank could only imagine how his son was reacting to learning that his father had been tossed in front of his daughter. Dr. Chin returned with Frank's blood work results. "Everything looks normal, Mr. Martinez. Your heart is handling the stress well. But I'd still like to keep you for a few more hours for observation." "Doc, can my family come in? My granddaughter saw the whole thing, and I need her to see that I'm okay." Dr. Chin glanced toward the door where the suited men were still waiting. "I'll see what I can do. But first, these gentlemen are very insistent about speaking with you. Do you have any idea why federal agents would be interested in your case?" Federal agents. The words hit Frank like a cold slap. This wasn't about local police procedure or even a civil rights violation. Somehow, his routine school pickup had triggered federal attention, and he had no earthly idea why. "Doc, I honestly don't know. I was picking up my granddaughter from school, same as I do twice a week. The police thought I was someone suspicious. Things escalated, and here we are. I can't imagine why federal agents would care about any of that." Dr. Chin studied his face for a moment, then nodded. "I believe you, but somebody thinks you're important enough to send a small army after. I'm going to let your family in first, then we'll deal with the suits." She left the room and returned a few minutes later with David and Emma. Frank's son looked like he had aged 10 years in the past few hours. His usually neat courtroom appearance was disheveled, his tie loosened, and his hair messed up as if he had been running his hands through it repeatedly. But it was Emma who captured Frank's attention. She ran to his bedside with tears streaming down her face, reaching up to touch his hand as if she needed to confirm that he was really alive and okay. "Grandpa, I was so scared. Why did those policemen hurt you? You didn't do anything wrong." Frank felt his own eyes fill with tears as he took her small hand in his. "I know, sweetheart. Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes, even policemen. But I'm okay, see? The doctors took good care of me." David approached the bed, his prosecutor's eyes taking in the medical equipment and the taser barbs that had been removed from Frank's shirt. "Dad, what the hell happened?" "I got a call from Emma's school saying you had been tossed by police, and then when I got there, it was crawling with federal agents. Nobody will tell me anything. I wish I knew, son." I was picking up Emma, just like always, and the police thought I matched some description of a suspicious person. Things got out of hand pretty quickly. David's jaw tightened. Out of hand? Dad, they used a taser on a 68-year-old man with a heart condition in front of his granddaughter. That's not out of hand. That's assault. Before Frank could respond, there was a knock on the door. Dr. Chun entered, followed by two men in dark suits. The lead agent was tall and lean with prematurely gray hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. His partner was younger, built like a linebacker, with the alert posture of enhanced security. Mr. Martinez, I'm Agent Collins with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. This is Agent Rodriguez. We need to speak with you about this afternoon's incident. David immediately stepped forward, his prosecutor instincts kicking in. I'm David Martinez, Mr. Martinez's son and legal counsel. My father isn't saying anything until I know what this is about and what charges, if any, are being considered. Agent Collins held up a placating hand. Mr. Martinez isn't being charged with anything, counselor. But we do need to understand how he became involved in a situation that triggered multiple security protocols. Frank felt Emma's grip on his hand tighten. She was trying to be brave, but the appearance of more official-looking men was clearly frightening her again. Could we maybe continue this conversation without my granddaughter present? Frank asked. She's been through enough today. Agent Collins looked at Emma, and his expression softened slightly. Of course. Perhaps Mrs. Martinez could take her to the cafeteria. It's just us, David said curtly. Emma's mother isn't in the picture, but I can ask one of the nurses to sit with her. Dr. Chin stepped forward. I'll take her to see our therapy dog in the children's wing. Emma, would you like to meet a very friendly golden retriever named Murphy? Emma looked uncertain, glancing between Frank and the strangers in suits. Frank squeezed her hand gently. It's okay, sweetheart. Grandpa needs to talk to these men for a few minutes, and then we'll go home. Go see the doggy with Dr. Chun. After Emma left with the doctor, Agent Collins pulled up a chair next to Frank's bed. Mr. Martinez, we need to understand your background and why your presence at that school might have triggered certain alerts. Alerts? David interjected. What kind of alerts? Agent Rodriguez consulted a tablet. Mr. Martinez, you served in Vietnam from 1972 to 1974. 2 tours, combat medic, honorable discharge. You received a Purple Heart and a Bronze Star for actions near Da Nang. Frank nodded, confused about where this was leading. That's correct. After your discharge, you worked at Henderson Manufacturing for 30 years. Clean background check, no criminal history, no flags in any database. Right again. So, can you explain why your vehicle license plate triggered a BOLO alert that flagged you as a potential security threat? Frank stared at them in complete bewilderment. What alert? David's face had gone pale. As a prosecutor, he knew what a BOLO alert was. Be on the lookout. They were issued for wanted criminals, terrorists, and other high-priority security threats. Gentlemen, David said carefully, I think there's been a serious mistake here. My father is a retired factory worker and Vietnam veteran with no criminal history. He's not involved in anything that would warrant federal attention. Agent Collins studied Frank's face intently. Mr. Martinez, have you had any contact recently with anyone from your military service? Any old Army buddies reach out to you? Any reunions or gatherings? Frank thought for a moment. No, not recently. Most of the guys I serve with are either dead or scattered to the wind. We weren't the kind of unit that stayed in touch much after the war. What about your unit designation? What was your official assignment? I was with the 23rd Medical Battalion, primarily attached to infantry units in the field. We provided battlefield medical support. The two agents exchanged glances that Frank didn't like. Agent Rodriguez made a note on his tablet, then showed it to his partner. Agent Collins read it and frowned. Mr. Martinez, I'm going to ask you a question, and I need you to think very carefully about your answer. During your time in Vietnam, did you ever have any contact with personnel from other government agencies? CIA, military intelligence, special operations units? Frank's stomach began to sink as memories from nearly 50 years ago started to surface. There had been operations classified missions where his medical unit had supported teams that didn't wear regular Army insignia. He had always assumed they were special forces or reconnaissance units, but thinking back now, there might have been some joint operations, Frank said slowly. But that was nearly 50 years ago, and most of it was classified. I never knew the details of what those units were doing. Agent Collins leaned forward. Mr. Martinez, we believe someone has been using your identity or your background to cover activities that have caught our attention. The Bolo alert on your license plate was generated because your name and service record appeared in connection with some very sensitive ongoing investigations. David stood up abruptly. Are you saying my father is being impersonated, or that he's suspected of current criminal activity? We're trying to figure that out, counselor. But what happened today at that school may not have been a case of mistaken identity by local police. Someone may have deliberately triggered a response to expose Mr. Martinez's current location and activities. Frank felt the room spinning slightly, and it wasn't from the aftereffects of the taser. The idea that his simple life in retirement was somehow connected to current federal investigations was almost impossible to process. Agent Collins, Frank said quietly, I pick up my granddaughter from school twice a week. I go to the grocery store, I watch baseball games, and I read library books. I'm not involved in anything illegal or dangerous. But if someone is using my name or my background for something bad, then we need to figure out what's going on. Agent Collins nodded. That's exactly what we intend to do, Mr. Martinez. But first, we need to make sure you and your family are safe. Because if someone has been using your identity for covert operations, then exposing your real location today may have put you in considerable danger. Outside the hospital room, Frank could hear the sounds of normal emergency room activity. Patients being treated, families waiting for news, medical staff going about their daily routines. But inside the room, the atmosphere had shifted into something that felt more like a war briefing than a medical consultation. Frank Martinez, who had thought his fighting days were long behind him, was beginning to realize that his most dangerous battle might be just beginning. And this time, the enemy was invisible, unknown, and apparently using his own identity as a weapon. The secure conference room at the FBI field office was nothing like Frank had expected. Instead of the sterile, intimidating environment he had imagined, it felt more like a corporate boardroom with comfortable chairs, good lighting, and even a coffee service set up on a side table. Dr. Chun had released him from the hospital after 6 hours of observation, and now, 12 hours after the incident at Emma's school, Frank found himself at the center of a federal investigation that still made no sense to him. Agent Collins had assembled what he called the team, a collection of specialists that included a cybersecurity expert, an analyst from the Department of Defense, and a woman introduced simply as Ms. Harper, who carried herself with the quiet authority of someone very senior in the intelligence community. David sat beside his father, still in his role as legal counsel, though the agents had assured them multiple times that Frank was not a suspect in any wrongdoing. Emma was safely at home with her Aunt Sarah, David's sister, who had driven up from Phoenix the moment she heard what had happened. Mr. Martinez, Agent Collins began, we spent the night investigating the alert that flagged your license plate, and what we've discovered is both fascinating and disturbing. The cybersecurity expert, a young woman named Agent Park, opened a laptop and projected an image onto the wall screen. It showed what appeared to be a complex network diagram with nodes and connections spreading across multiple countries. 3 months ago, our cyber division identified a sophisticated identity theft operation targeting veterans from specific units that served in Vietnam between 1970 and 1975. The stolen identities were being used to create cover stories for international arms dealers and other criminal enterprises. Frank studied the diagram, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. And you think someone stole my identity? Ms. Harper spoke for the first time, her voice carrying the crisp authority of decades in intelligence work. Not exactly, Mr. Martinez. Your identity wasn't stolen in the traditional sense. It was borrowed, enhanced, and used as a foundation for creating a completely fictional person who shared your background but had additional experiences that would justify certain activities and access levels. David leaned forward. Can you explain that in plain English? Agent Park clicked to the next slide, which showed two profiles side by side. One was clearly Frank's real military record, his actual service dates, assignments, and decorations. The other showed the same basic information, but with additional entries that Frank had never seen before. The fictional version of your father shows additional classified assignments, special operations training, and security clearances that he never actually possessed. This enhanced identity was then used to obtain legitimate credentials and access to sensitive materials and locations. Frank stared at the screen in amazement. The fake version of his service record included assignments to units he had never heard of, training he had never received, and clearance levels he had never possessed. But it was skillfully done, building on his real record in ways that would be difficult to detect without a thorough investigation. How long has this been going on? Frank asked. Ms. Harper consulted her own notes. We believe approximately 18 months. The operation was sophisticated enough that it took our analysts considerable time to identify the pattern. What exposed it was a routine security audit that flagged multiple instances of the same base identity being used for different purposes. Agent Collins pulled up another slide showing a timeline of activities. The person or persons using your enhanced identity have been involved in arms purchases, technology transfers, and financial transactions across 4 countries. All completely legal on the surface, but part of a larger pattern that suggests coordination with hostile foreign interests. Frank felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. So, when I showed up at Emma's school yesterday, someone somewhere knew that the real Frank Martinez was operating independently of their fake Frank Martinez. Exactly, Agent Park confirmed. The Bolo alert was generated automatically when your license plate was scanned by local police patrol units. The system flagged a potential security breach. The real Frank Martinez was supposed to be in Eastern Europe conducting business, not picking up his granddaughter from school in suburban Arizona. David ran his hands through his hair, a gesture Frank recognized from his son's childhood when he was trying to process something overwhelming. So the police response yesterday wasn't excessive force against an innocent man. It was a counterintelligence operation triggered by automated systems. Ms. Harper nodded grimly. The local officers had no way of knowing they were walking into the middle of a federal investigation. They received what appeared to be a routine call about suspicious activity, but the situation escalated because multiple law enforcement systems were flagging Mr. Martinez as a high-priority security concern. Frank thought about the young officer who had tossed him, and for the first time since the incident, he felt a flicker of sympathy for the man. That kid was just doing his job. He probably thought he was apprehending a dangerous criminal. Unfortunately, yes, Agent Collins agreed. And the situation could have been much worse if backup units had arrived before we were able to intervene and clarify the situation. Agent Park brought up a new screen showing what appeared to be financial records. The good news is that we've been able to trace the network using your identity, and we've identified most of the key players. The bad news is that they now know we're onto them, which could make them desperate. Frank didn't like the implications of that statement. Desperate how? Ms. Harper's expression was serious. The people running this operation have invested significant time and resources in building these false identities. Now that their primary cover identity has been compromised, they may attempt to eliminate any connections that could lead back to them. Are you saying my family is in danger? We're saying we're taking every precaution, Agent Collins replied diplomatically. We've arranged for protection for you, your son, and Emma while we complete our investigation and make arrests. David stood up and began pacing, his prosecutor instincts clearly working through the legal implications. What kind of protection? For how long? And what about Emma's school? Our jobs, our normal lives? Ms. Harper leaned back in her chair. Mr. Martinez, your father's case is actually going to help us bring down an international criminal network that has been operating for years. His cooperation, and the family's cooperation, is essential to completing this investigation safely. Frank looked around the room at all the serious faces, then thought about Emma asking him why the policeman had hurt him. The idea that his 8-year-old granddaughter might be in danger because criminals had stolen his identity filled him with a rage that surprised him with its intensity. "What do you need from me?" Frank asked. Agent Park smiled for the first time since the meeting began. "We need you to be yourself, Mr. Martinez. Continue your normal routine. Keep picking up Emma from school. Maintain your regular activities. But you'll have surveillance protection, and we'll be monitoring communications to see if anyone tries to make contact with you. You want to use me as bait. We want to use the situation to our advantage," Ms. Harper corrected. "The criminals know that the real Frank Martinez has surfaced, which means their operation is compromised. They may try to intimidate you into silence, or they may try to recruit you into their activities by offering you money or other incentives." Frank almost laughed at that. "Ma'am, I spent 2 years being shot at by people who wanted me dead. I'm not going to be intimidated by a bunch of criminals, and I'm certainly not going to be recruited by them." Agent Collins stood up and extended his hand to Frank. "Mr. Martinez, I believe you, and I think this investigation is going to be concluded much more quickly than we originally hoped, thanks to your cooperation." As they shook hands, Frank thought about the events of the past 24 hours. Yesterday morning, he had been a simple grandfather picking up his granddaughter from school. Now he was apparently an unwitting participant in an international counterintelligence operation. "One last question," Frank said. "The officers who responded yesterday, are they going to face any consequences for what happened?" Agent Collins exchanged glances with Ms. Harper. The older officer, Sergeant Williams, will be commended for his handling of a complex situation once he realized federal interests were involved. The younger officer, he paused. Officer Thompson will receive additional training on de-escalation techniques and appropriate use of force. The incident will remain on his record, but he won't face criminal charges. Frank nodded. It wasn't perfect justice, but it was fair given the circumstances. As the meeting concluded and they prepared to leave the federal building, Frank put his arm around David's shoulders. "Son, when you were a kid and complained about your boring old dad, did you ever imagine something like this would happen?" David managed a tired smile. "Dad, when I was a kid, I thought you had the most exciting life possible because you had been to war. I never imagined that the war would follow you home 50 years later." Frank looked out the window at the Arizona sunshine and thought about Emma waiting for him at home, probably with a new drawing she had made for him. Tomorrow was Thursday, which meant another school pickup, another routine afternoon that was no longer routine. But as they walked toward the exit, Frank realized that despite everything that had happened, the tossing, the hospital visit, the federal investigation, he wasn't afraid. He was angry that criminals had used his name and threatened his family's safety, but he wasn't afraid. He had survived worse than this, and he would survive whatever came next. After all, he was Frank Martinez, Vietnam veteran, grandfather, and apparently, according to international criminals, a very valuable identity. It was time to show them just how valuable the real Frank Martinez could be. The Arizona sun was shining brightly as they left the federal building, and Frank could see unmarked cars taking positions around them as they walked to David's car. Protection detail, Agent Collins had called it. Frank preferred to think of it as backup. Either way, Emma would be getting picked up from school as usual. Some things, Frank decided, were more important than international conspiracies, and protecting his granddaughter's routine was at the top of that list.